to most, and of course we reach many, many more people through the mass media than in real world events. So thank you for videotaping this event, which will reach many times the number of people who are here, but they won't get to ask questions and tell me where I'm wrong and make arguments. You all see what the United Kingdom did today, leaving the European Union? Good, bad, whatever your position, and there are actually decent arguments on both sides, that's something we don't get to do. I mean, raise your hand if you would vote to leave NAFTA. Raise your hand if you would vote to leave NATO.
Yeah.
Well, not everybody, but most of you. Yeah, me too. We don't get to do these sorts of things. Now, shout out, without thinking, just shout out the first country that comes to mind when I say this phrase. Greatest democracy on earth.
Canada.
America.
Yeah, it took a lot of thought, but somebody came up with America. A lot of people would say the United States, and it has to be because the United States wages wars in the name of democracy. It's not because we get to vote on anything, ever. It's not because we have representatives in Washington who represent majority opinion on many major issues. What if the United States could have the sort of, what if the states, each of the 50 states, could have the sort of increased power that members of the European Union actually have when they're in it, or provinces in Canada actually have within the Federation of Canada? Would you vote for that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Many people might not. You know, we are taught to fear democracy. And of course, some US states, if given more power, would do horrible things. Many would do wonderful things beyond what anybody is willing to even dream of at this point. But I suspect that just about nobody in power in the United States right now thinks that on balance that would be a good thing compared to continuing to allow Washington, D.C. to do catastrophic things. What if we could have a public referendum before they could start any war? Would you want that?
Yes.
You know, we almost had that almost a century ago. Anybody remember what it was called? The Ludlow Amendment came very close to passing in the 1930s, killed off by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I've never seen it mentioned in a single history textbook ever. How about this? How about if you could vote for public funding of elections, no bribery, free airtime for candidates, open debates and ballots, no gerrymandering, hand-counted paper ballots, international monitors, no electoral college, no delegates, no superdelegates, and a 3-month election season with a bit of actual governing in between before the next election season started? Would you vote for any of those things?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Right, but you can't vote for any of those things. Greatest democracy on earth. What if we could vote to take military spending back to 2001 levels and tax corporations and billionaires at 1960 levels and restore the minimum wage to its 1968 level and guarantee everyone top quality free education, preschool through college, health care, job training as needed, vacation, family leave, retirement, transportation, child care, clean energy, public parks, sustainable agriculture, and significant aid to the rest of the world?
How do we get it? Yeah.
Well, for a start, that would be.
It would be Scandinavia, is what it would be. How about, would you vote for a ban on the sale of machine guns to individuals?
Yes.
How about a ban on the sale or gift of weapons of war to local police departments?
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, see, every time there's a mass killing in the United States, there's a certain segment of the population that no matter what the fear-mongering and demagoguery is willing to recognize the problem with the guns, the problem of needing arms control within the United States. You know, Australia had a mass killing, they banned guns, You know, now it costs more to get your hands on a gun in Australia than you could rob from just about any house in Australia. You know, they haven't had a mass killing since. They don't have gun problems. Norway had a mass killing, reacted with a remarkable fit of sanity and decency and integrity. They haven't had another one. We don't really in the United States expect anymore that anyone will look at what works and study it and figure out the practical solution and then act on it, right? I mean, there's nobody studying, does mass incarceration increase or decrease crime? Does a global war on terrorism increase or decrease terrorism? You know, with the expectation that the result is gonna make a difference to anyone, right? Because Washington, D.C. doesn't actually act based on social science or what's going to work. What does it act on?
The money.
$3 million a year to lobbyists from the NRA and $600,000 a year from the NRA in what other countries call bribes and we call campaign contributions. Now, there's a complicated relationship between this guy in Orlando and ISIS, right? Because the media loves foreign terrorists and loves to demonize someone as a foreign terrorist, even if they're not foreign. And here's a guy who says he swore allegiance to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hamas, groups that are actually at war with each other, right? He, as far as we know, he didn't have any actual contact with any of these groups, but he swore allegiance to them. And so anybody who's deranged enough to commit this sort of mass murder has got a whole complex web of motivations and bigotry and self-hatred and fear and resentment of humiliation and so forth. But I think it's important not to overlook what he said on a phone call to 911 and what he said according to witnesses. And that is that he said he was motivated by wanting the United States to stop bombing people, stop killing women and children, stop blowing up houses. And he reportedly said, according to one African-American witness, maybe others, but only one that I came across, that he wasn't acting against black people, that he thought they had had a hard enough time already and he had nothing against them. This sounds like someone trying to justify himself as acting on behalf of historical and social justice, right? Revenge for horrible deeds, which, you know, many people like to think of themselves as doing. But it's worth noting that every single actual foreign terrorist and foreign terrorist organization that has attacked the United States or tried to in recent decades has given the exact same motivation. We want to stop the bombing, right? Which is the last thing ISIS wants. Stop the bombing. ISIS loses the ability to motivate crazy people to pick up guns and kill. You know, ISIS had put out full-length films a couple of years ago asking for the bombing. You know, but this is what drives people, and we kick ourselves around and wonder, you know, what do they hate us for? Why do they not like our freedoms and so forth? I don't know of a single exception to every single person and group giving the same explanation: stop the bombing. So, you know, and this is true also, of course, of dozens of poor suckers put up and armed and supplied and framed and encouraged by the FBI and then busted in sting operations, which they tried with this guy. The FBI tried to lure him into a terrorist act, and he wouldn't go along with it, and they decided, oh, he's no danger to anybody, let's leave him alone. Right? This was the FBI's role. So there are many, many, many steps that could be taken to reduce violence from, you know, to make the United States safer. You would start, you know, with diet and exercise and unsafe workplaces and, you know, unsafe roads and the things that really kill in large numbers. But to make the United States safer in terms of mass killings, many, many steps you could take. But the first two, far and away, are obvious. You get rid of the guns and you stop bombing people's countries. I mean, these are the obvious steps. It's so far removed from U.S. understanding that you had a woman on, a reporter on NPR, right when Orlando happened, say, you know, in Spain, when there was a terrorist attack on a train in Spain, or a train station in Spain, the Spanish people quickly elected a right-wing government and gave ISIS help, which is exactly the opposite of what happened back in 2004 when there was a terrorist attack on Spain. Spain very publicly and openly acknowledged that this was blowback for its role in a U.S. war on Iraq, elected a leftist government, and pulled out of Iraq, and hasn't had similar incidents since. You know, so we have this mythology built into our heads so deeply that we, you know, fantasize that the opposite of what really happens happens. So you get rid of the guns and you pursue peace. But peace, I think, principally is not about stopping the bombing. Principally, it's about stopping the arms sales and arms gifts to foreign nations. And I don't know why the logic of arms control has to stop at the water's edge, right? Because the ISIS videos have U.S. guns, U.S. Humvees. They're armed to the teeth with U.S. weapons. And we don't stop and think, what would it be without those weapons, the way that some of us have learned to do in the domestic scene, right? You have most wars in the world now with U.S. weapons. Many wars with U.S. weapons on both sides. You have U.S. armed and trained Pentagon proxy troops in Syria fighting against troops armed and trained by the CIA in Syria, which is just beyond having U.S. weapons on both sides. Right? The majority of weapons sales and gifts on Earth from the United States, you know, over half of weapons sales each year from the United States, over half the weapons sales to countries in the Middle East, most of them dictatorships, over half the weapons sales to poor countries from the United States. This is not counting gifts, this is not counting the U.S. military's presence with its weapons. And we look at the NRA and we get outraged about that $3 million and that $600,000. The weapons companies, the foreign military weapons companies spend $127 million a year on lobbyists and $27 million a year on bribes, including $4,500 last year to a guy named Bob Goodlatte. Plus their primary tool of control, which is the threat to eliminate jobs, the threat to pull jobs out of a district or a state. Roanoke, in a year, the people of Roanoke spend about $66 million on the Department of so-called defense. You have to nearly double that to get U.S. military spending, which goes through numerous departments, Homeland Security, Energy, State Department, etc. What does Roanoke get back? It gets back the shame of mass murder, it gets back hatred for the United States, it gets back violence, it gets back environmental destruction on a global scale, the erosion of our civil liberties, the permeating of our culture with violence and hatred and racism, and $79 million a year in military contracts in Roanoke, which can then be threatened with removal. And we think of that as somehow economically beneficial, that $79 million in military contracts. It isn't. It's a charade. It's a lie. If you spend $79 million on education, infrastructure, energy, or even tax cuts for ordinary people, you get more jobs and better paying jobs. But what if it were true? I mean, what if it were true that it was economically beneficial? Would that justify it? I mean, how would that sound to you if you lived outside of the United States? The longest running war that may have ended yesterday in Colombia had from the United States for decades what the United States calls military aid, which means weapons and training of assassins and torturers. The other thing about weapons is they hardly ever stay in one place. ISIS has weapons that belong to the Iraqi government, that belong to the Libyan government. Rarely do weapons stay in one place. And the poor countries where the wars happen where 95% of the dying in the wars happen, because it's the people who live in the countries where the wars happen who die, don't make any weapons. They don't make any weapons. Remember, Franklin Roosevelt's mother's family got rich selling opium to China. It used to be, before that, very popular to give alcohol to the natives of this continent. What do the rich people in the world give to the poor countries now? Weapons. Weapons. Small arms sales have tripled in the world since 2001, during which time, yes, the global war on terrorism has predictably and indisputably increased terrorism, as accounted to by numerous top U.S. military officials the day after they retire. We should, there are poor countries where you can get an AK-47 for $10 and you cannot get a glass of clean water to save your life, and we talk about military aid as if we're aiding somebody. There was a top U.S. Air Force official several weeks back now who said that we've got a technology to drop food accurately in Syria on people who are starving to death, but it costs $60,000. We would never use it in a merely humanitarian operation, while spending tens of billions of dollars to kill people just in that little corner of the world, right? So we have to have a different set of priorities when it comes to calling something aid. And I think we have to have a different view of cause and effect when it comes to looking at these weapons, right? Because we know you cannot kill people in a nightclub in Orlando that rapidly, if you don't have that kind of weapon, if you don't have that kind of tool that kills thousands of times faster than anything that existed when the Second Amendment was drafted, right? But the same is true abroad, right? I mean, we look at toddlers, little kids in the United States, who kill more Americans with guns than do foreign terrorists by far. And the cause and effect is very clear. The cause is people leaving their guns lying around. The effect is the toddlers finding them and shooting them. But we look at ISIS and we say, well, they're adults. We have to blame them, and that's true. We do. We also have to blame the US government, which destroyed Iraq and destroyed Libya and did all kinds of misdeeds in Syria and tortured future ISIS leaders in prison camps. There has to be responsibility for that too. And when you flood a region with weapons, you can blame you can say it's an inherently violent region, you can blame their backwardness or their skin color or their religion, but without the weapons, there could not be the level of violence. There could not be the sort of power that a group like ISIS finds. I think it was Jason who pointed me to an article recently on a city council member down in Durham, North Carolina, who's in a lot of hot water for saying that the military and the police, when they have guns, are the greatest danger. And I think you can make some serious arguments on both sides of that sort of coin. But I had written an article after Orlando, wondering, what if military killings were reported the same way that civilian killings are reported? And so I imagined this news report. Unreported mass killing leaves thousands dead. In what's being called the worst mass killing by the United States in the past 6 months, numerous mentally disturbed individuals with the extensive backing of a well-financed terrorist organization and support from a growing circle of allied gang members have gruesomely slaughtered 1,110 to 1,558 innocent men, women, and children. This incident, which has left shocked and speechless a handful of people who've heard and thought about it, took place between December 1st, 2015 and May 31st, 2016, during which interval the killers got off 4,087 airstrikes, including 3,010 over Iraq and 1,077 over Syria. Aiding and abetting the slaughter and now also being sought by law enforcement are France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Netherlands, Australia, Denmark, and Canada. In what is widely understood as an appeal for judicial mercy, Canada has expressed remorse. Not really, but they did stop doing it. None of the other alleged perpetrators has done so. Several have openly acknowledged their participation, including by displaying the gang symbol of a U.S. flag tattooed on their booty-eyed maximi. An offshoot terrorist group said to have been inspired by the United States and going by the name of Russia during the same period has brutally murdered 2,792 to 3,451 innocents using similar techniques apparently copied from those of the US gang. Despite being well documented, these murders have gone largely unreported in US media outlets working overtime to focus on a smaller slaughter in Orlando, Florida. The death counts are imprecise but highly selective, as they intentionally exclude all casualties deemed to be those of combatants. In a coincidental connection, the Orlando killer blamed the US bombings in Iraq and Syria for his own murderous rampage. Adding to the bizarre connections, members of the US public and presidential candidates from both major parties have been heard blaming the Orlando slaughter for additional airstrikes to come. Commented an alien in a ship approaching the planet Earth, "Reverse engines, get us out of here. Let's try back in 10 years and see if anybody's left." End of news report. Now, the NRA recently compared Democrats to terrorists, not for Democrats' support of numerous wars and drone murders, but for a sit-in on the floor of Congress. The NRA recently put out a video featuring a country singer named Charlie Daniels, best known for a hit called "The Devil Went Down to Georgia." Never understood where the devil was from, if Georgia was down, but somewhere around here. This is a video in which Charlie Daniels threatens Iran with a US attack, pushes for an attack on Iran, brags that Iran could never withstand the force and violence of good old Americans, and this is an NRA video. Now, why would the NRA be pushing a foreign war?
Weapon sales.
Yeah, weapon sales, but weapon sales mostly here to Americans who mostly, 99% of Americans, have nothing to do with participating in a war. But if you look at a poll that Gallup did a couple years back, less than that, asked people in numerous countries, would you participate in a war for your country? And to the great credit of the world, many countries were like down near the single digits of who would actually participate in a war. 44% of Americans said I would participate in a war. The United States always has wars, always. There's nothing stopping them. They don't actually want to participate in a war, but they want to go buy guns and shoot stuff in the backyard and fantasize that they're attacking Iran. Right? The problem with fantasies is they often become reality. Sometimes have leaders of the reality, like Ronald Reagan, who can't tell the difference between the fantasy and the reality, but often it becomes a reality. The United States now has at least 7 major wars happening right now today by anybody's definition. 7 countries that the current US president has bragged about having bombed, 5 of them with significant number of US ground troops on the ground now. Raise your hand if you can name those 7 countries. Jason thinks he can.
With a shaky hand.
You want to try?
Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Iraq, Lebanon? No.
Very, very good. Better than most events I've been at in big cities in this country. Pakistan, I was looking for Pakistan. A lot of drone strikes in Pakistan. No serious ground troops on the ground in Pakistan or Somalia that I know of yet. This has never happened before in the history of the earth. I mean, the Roman Empire could keep track of its wars. Never before in the history of the world has there been so many wars that you couldn't even keep track of them. And every people, almost half the country says they would fight in a war if there were one. And 90% of the country says some wars are justified sometimes, as if they've studied the wars and decided which ones are justified and which aren't. And almost nobody can even name them. You had a presidential debate in December where one of the candidates was asked, are you willing, as part of your basic duties as president, to kill hundreds and thousands of innocent children? Didn't make a big scandal, not a big news story, just an ordinary question. It never, ever could have happened anywhere else on earth. in a Republican government, in a public debate. This is war normalized. I have a friend I respect who gives me an argument for a certain presidential candidate that I never would have heard before in my lifetime, which is that, well, at least she's not an overt racist. This is like the qualification to be a superior presidential candidate now. You gotta not look at the demographics of all the nations bombed and governments overthrown, but it's not overt racism. This is the standard. War has become normal. It's never before been in so many countries, so many bases, so many troops watch the basketball game and they thank the troops for watching in 175 countries, and nobody blinks, nobody asks would 174 be enough. They're just now opening a base on the very tip of South America. I'm not going to feel safe until they open that one. What the hell for? What the hell for? I saw a car in Charlottesville the other day with the back of the car has an American flag and the words, "There is only one." And I'm thinking, yeah, because the world couldn't survive two. There's no way the world could survive two. So I want to take lots of questions, but I want to say a few brief words about a couple of my books and about your local misrepresentative in Congress and about things that we can do. One book I wrote is called War is a Lie, which is a guidebook to, as quickly as possible, recognizing war lies. In 2001 and in 2003, you had polls showing a majority wanting a war in this country, right? Usually we do okay once it's made into a question of war or no war. We did wonderfully last year on that, make an agreement with Iran rather than a war. 3 years back, bomb the hell out of Syria or not. Once it's made into a war or no war question, usually we get it right. But that Syria answer in 2013 was largely because it was too close to Iraq 2003. And peace activists had made Iraq 2003, first of all, criminal at the UN, and then a badge of shame. So that 8 years ago, you couldn't get nominated for president if you voted for that thing, And now you can say it was wrong not to bomb Syria in 2013, which will probably put ISIS in charge of the whole place, and get nominated, having voted for, and pushed all the lies for Iraq in 2003. But you had these majorities for attacking Afghanistan and Iraq, and in both cases, within a year and a half, you had solid majorities from that moment to today saying we never should have started that war, right? So there's a segment of the US population that would like to catch on more quickly, right? And so the book doesn't go through a list of wars, it goes through types of lies, because there are only 6 or 8 major types of lies, and they drag them out with new variations and examples, so I give numerous examples. And a lot of how you can most quickly recognize the problem is by understanding that, yes, they're lying about the facts, but they're also asking the wrong question to begin with, right? So what if every lie about weapons in Iraq, which were obvious lies, had been true? Doesn't legally, morally, practically justify a war. The United States had all those weapons openly acknowledged. We didn't want to be bombed, right? What if the Gulf of Tonkin incident had actually happened, right? Why wait decades for Freedom of Information Act requests and so forth? Why not understand that when the United States is bombing the coast of Vietnam and a Vietnamese ship is alleged to have shot back, that isn't actually an attack on California. It isn't actually aggression. When, in recent weeks, you have these incidents where a Russian plane flies near a US plane in the Baltic Sea, right? Do we need a big investigation of the Russian government, or can we get out a globe, find the Baltic Sea, see which coast of the United States it's on, and understand that this is the problem, that they're asking the wrong questions, right? Because you can't justify a war, not legally, not morally, not practically. And so you have to make up bogus questions, and then, yes, usually feed in false answers, but recognize the problem. So so this is the point of my book, and I like to think it's helped some people a little bit I've been very encouraged by how people have done, especially in 2013, recognizing the lies about needing to bomb Syria. In 2014, when there were videos of white people getting killed by a knife, which is much worse than a nuclear bomb, and everybody said, go ahead and have a war, what do we care? Have a war on the opposite side of where you said we had the moral obligation to have the war last year. Actually, fight the war on both sides, anything goes, do what you want. That sort of, inability to confront fear-mongering is where we need the most work done, and what I try to address in the book. This is a book that I did an initial version of 5 years ago, and now have an updated edition which documents the continuation of all the endless war lies during the past 5 years. The other book that I have the most copies of with me is called When the World Outlawed War. I may have said this so many times you'll catch on to the answer I'm looking for, but raise your hand if you think a war can sometimes be legal. 1, 2.
What do you mean by can sometimes be legal?
Be in accordance with existing laws. The ordinary definition of legal. So, under the UN Charter, none of the US wars of recent decades has been legal, but there has been the pretense that because the UN Charter allows certain narrow exceptions for certain wars, that some of these wars have been legal. People like to imagine that, well, maybe it has. You've even had law professors on the drone wars go into Congress and testify, well, if it's part of a war, it might be legal, and I can't know if it's part of a war unless I see the president's secret memos, but if it's not part of a war, well, then it's obviously murder. As if the president can write something on a piece of paper, hide it in a drawer, because he doesn't show it to you, what looks like murder is legal. But what makes the war legal? Nothing. For one thing, because in addition to the UN Charter, there's something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was created in 1928, which is a treaty that most big nations are party to, that bans all war. Pure and simple. And that was the production of a peace movement in the 1920s that was far bigger, far more principled, far more radical, far more mainstream, far better funded, and everything else than anything we've seen since. And so this book is the story of the creation of this treaty and the peace movement that did it and how they did it, mainly for examples of what we could do as activists, but also because we might want to hold up that law. When they want to legalize torture or campaign bribery, they pull out stuff like vetoes that were overridden and marginalia in court hearings and stuff that's not laws. We have laws, we have treaties that do, what we don't dare dream of, that ban all war, that require full employment. It would be useful for us sometimes to hold these things up and say, why don't we comply with this? So, about Mr. Goodlatte, the House Judiciary Committee website now lists, with logos and names, corporate sponsors of laws, corporate supporters. You go to, including the NRA, right? You go to this website of the House Judiciary Committee, the Law Oversight Committee, right? And you click on things like the Freedom Act, the USA Freedom Act, which God knows when they name something there goes some more freedoms. And look at the logos of the organizations and lobby groups and interests like the NRA, publicly listed there, right? So, when people joke about Congress members should wear NASCAR uniforms with the logos of who's bought them, right? This is not a joke, right? It's there. During this gentleman's oversight of the Department of So-Called Justice, that department has put out documents purporting to legalize murder by missile from drone. I don't know that there's been a peep out of that committee. Wars by the scores without Congress, without the United Nations, without any sort of legal fig leaf, right? Not a peep out of that committee. You know, wars that are launched and then Congress is told after the fact. This was one of the articles of impeachment brought against Nixon over Cambodia, right? Not a peep. You have a Department of Justice that has gone after whistleblowers more fiercely than any previous administration, at least back to World War I, has put people like Jeffrey Sterling, who worked at the CIA and thought we should know the CIA was giving Iran nuclear weapons plans. He's in a prison in Colorado. The New York Times reporter who couldn't get it in the New York Times but published it in a book, James Risen, they tried to put him in prison. But when it comes to people in power, David Petraeus, Hillary Clinton, you know, it's a slap on the wrist or less. What have we seen out of this committee? Any sort of concern? The so-called Homeland Security Department, overseen or, you know, not overseen by this committee, assisting in training and arming police departments for war? Any concerns? And this is a congressman who, as much as any other, talks the lies about budget and budget cuts and small government and low spending, right? I mean, there's this pretense in U.S. politics that one party wants lots of spending and the other party wants no spending but a huge military. You know, the reality is they both want a huge military, but the problem is that the military alone is over half the money that they spend every year, the discretionary budget, the budget that Congress decides what to do with every year. So setting aside Social Security and Medicare, over half of it is militarism, right? 54% by the last calculation I've seen from the National Priorities Project. You know, and not a single presidential candidate, although they're asked, are you willing to kill thousands of innocent children? Not a single one of them has ever been asked, is 54% too much, too little, just right for the military? Who the hell knows what any of them think? It's, you know, the most basic questions that you would ask somebody running for public office just aren't asked. And it's something that could be raised with Congressman Goodlatte. You know, the national parks, which has never had anywhere close to $1 billion for a budget, while the military has about $1 trillion, about 1,000 times as much, is now looking for corporate sponsors for mountains and geysers. You know, I think each corporate sponsor of a mountain should be required to put its name on a war too. You know, this is where the money went. So things you can do. You don't have to be a Congress member to do a sit-in, right? They got it from us. We've done lots of sit-ins in their offices, and they weren't catered, you know.
Yeah.
And you can take the sit-ins to your local congressman's local office and sit on the floor and live broadcast your video just like they did from the floor of the House of Representatives and demand a response on the issues you care about. You can work on getting resolutions passed by your local government. You can work on creating new sister city relationships, preferably with towns in targeted nations. That is, the nations that still aren't in that list of 175 where the troops watch the Super Bowl. We're proposing an idea in Charlottesville that a lot of cities around the country have done, and that's establishing a spot for a peace pole, which is essentially a post with may peace prevail on earth in multiple languages on each side, set up in a public place that could then be used as a gathering place for events. You can work on local transition from war industries to peace industries. You can get a report done, show that it will be economically beneficial as well as morally beneficial. You can educate in the schools, in civic groups. You can do counter recruitment. You can get the tests out of the schools. You can get the veterans who speak the truth into the schools. You can pursue what the Pentagon sees as its greatest enemy on earth, and that is free college for Americans. You can work the media. There should be calls to talk shows, letters to editors, Getting Democracy Now! On the local stations, all of that. And don't just lobby officials, but lobby, there was, Jason mentioned a sort of overarching coalition, can't think of the word, of groups. The human rights groups that think they're more serious if they refuse, as a matter of principle, to take a position on any wars, have to understand the root cause of the symptoms they address. The environmental groups that are afraid to take on the biggest destroyer of the environment there is have to be talked to and encouraged to understand it's acceptable. We've got your back. There'll be support. Right? 10 years ago, you wouldn't have had corporations pulling out of North Carolina because it discriminated against gay people. And that didn't happen because somebody got elected. You know, all of those things that I said, would you vote for this, would you vote for that? You can't vote for any of them. And you never will vote for any of them. And major change has never come from voting for anything. It's come from a popular movement that builds momentum and changes a culture through nonviolent actions of all sorts. The immigrants' rights groups have to understand that they're refugee rights groups, that people are fleeing things that our government did. There's a wonderful bill in Congress now to end the selective service that should be passed. And there's a bill, a sort of pseudo-feminist progressive bill to extend the requirement to young women as well as young men that they register for the draft. We should be killing that, not supporting it. The BDS movement against Israel's wars needs to be supported and expanded to address, divesting from U.S. wars and weapons companies of all sorts. And we're planning a big conference in Washington, D.C. in September called No War 2016 with all the best speakers we could find in the country and the world and workshops on specific activist plans. And if you go to worldbeyondwar.org, you can read all about it and sign up to come. And I'm going to pass around a sign-up sheet. This is a statement that's a couple of sentences that says, I want to work to end all war. That's been signed by people in 134 countries. We're trying to get to 175, but if you are inclined to, you can sign it. And I would love to take any questions you've got.
Yeah.
Yes, back there.
By any chance, that conference in September, will you piggyback any civil disobedience with that?
Yes, so this is the week of the internet. The question is about the conference and civil disobedience. This is the week of the International Day of Peace. A group called Campaign Nonviolence is trying to organize, as they did last year, hundreds or thousands of nonviolent actions around the United States and elsewhere. And a group called the National Campaign for Nonviolent Resistance, along with Campaign Nonviolence and World Beyond War, is planning a nonviolent action in Washington, D.C. for the morning of the 26th, which is a Monday. The conference is the 23rd to the 25th, so a Friday to a middle of the day Sunday. We are encouraging people to sign up for the conference and the nonviolent action, but you can pick one or the other, or part of the conference and the nonviolent action. Whatever you think best. And we're planning conferences and actions, or both, in places all around the country and the world, and we're going to have a big one in Berlin, Germany that week, and have U.S. whistleblowers and former participants in the U.S. drone program delivering a petition to the German government asking them to close Ramstein Air Base, which is a communications hub for the drone program. And we're planning something in Ireland, and we've got resources and speakers and whatever we can do to help if you want to do something here. But here is, relatively speaking, so close to Washington that I would encourage you to go there. Yes?
Everyone remembers back in 1968 or something, we almost started World War III over one Soviet base in Cuba. But right now we have 97 military bases surrounding the country of Iran. And if we got that paranoid over one base, how paranoid do you think they are over 97 bases within minutes of destroying their country makes them feel?
Yeah, so the question, if you couldn't hear, is about all the U.S. bases around Iran and how Iranians might react to that. I think the easiest way to imagine it is to imagine what if Russia had kept the Warsaw Pact, had added Canada, Bermuda, Bahamas, Cuba, Mexico, to the Warsaw Pact, was doing military exercises on the borders of the United States, was putting nuclear weapons back into Cuba and Bermuda and Quebec, and was threatening and lying and fear-mongering about the United States government. Because there's a wonderful graphic I'm sure everyone's seen passed around on the internet with a picture of Iran and where all the U.S. bases are, and why did the Iranians put their country so close to our bases? But when they made that agreement with Iran last year, the nuclear agreement, where, by the way, you had both sides pushing the same destructive lies, right? One side saying, we need this agreement with Iran because the Iranians are such a menace and they have a nuclear weapons program. And the other side saying we need a war with Iran because the Iranians are such a menace and have a nuclear weapons program. Iran doesn't have and never had a nuclear weapons program. The United States and allies gave Iran nuclear energy back in the 70s. The CIA did give Iran nuclear weapons plans in the year 2000. This was a cockamamie scheme where they were trying to give them plans with errors in there. And they gave it to U.S. nuclear scientists. This is the CIA, your tax dollars at work. First they gave it to U.S. nuclear scientists who immediately spotted the flaws that had been introduced in the plans. But the Iranians aren't as good. So then they gave it to a Russian go-between who was the guy who was going to go and supposedly, for his own reasons, give it to the Iranians, and he immediately spotted the flaws. He wasn't ever supposed to know about them and pointed them out. So, but you weren't actually going to slow down a non-existent program by providing somebody with plans that had flaws in them. You were going to plant evidence of an Iranian nuclear weapons program. And as soon as they put, Jeffrey Sterling, a CIA employee who went through all the proper channels and everything you're supposed to do and went to Congress with this and was told to go to hell. Somebody went to James Risen from the New York Times. Could have been a congressional staffer, could have been anybody. They said, well, it must have been Jeffrey Sterling. We've got metadata. That harmless stuff the NSA has on everybody that'll never hurt you, is what they had on Jeffrey Sterling. They had when he talked on the phone to James Risen. No idea what either of them said, right? And nothing related to the case whatsoever had anything to do with Alexandria, Virginia. But if you want to get a jury that'll put somebody away for questioning militarism, that's the place to do it. So they put him on trial, and they brought in Condoleezza Rice and all the big shots, and they put him away in a prison in Colorado for supposedly, on the basis of no evidence, having done his legal duty of trying to inform the U.S. public that its government was absolutely out of control and behaving in a treasonous manner. And yet, Iran still did not develop a nuclear weapons program. Iran, the only nation to have been seriously attacked with chemical weapons, some of them from the state of Virginia, and not responded in kind as a matter of principle. Not ability, but principle. There was a poll at December 2013, there was a poll of 65 countries, and one of the questions was, what nation is the greatest threat to peace in the world? You guys have the same answer as the vast majority of people in the vast majority of countries on Earth, right? The global policemanship isn't actually appreciated. But in the United States, who won? Iran. Right, Iran. Usually we haven't just been talking about Iran, and I asked that question and nobody can get the answer. But yeah, Iran, which spends less than 1% what the United States does on its military, hasn't initiated a war in literally centuries, right? But this is the power of televisions. People in the military machine of all history, the U.S. empire, are afraid of Iran and think it's a threat to peace in the world. Which means that when they tell the lies they're now telling about Star Wars, which I'm not sure Reagan knew if it was a movie or real, people believe it. Because what did they want to do when Obama came in? They wanted to put Star Wars, so-called missile defense bases, missile bases, on the border of Russia. They wanted to put them in Poland and in the Czech Republic. the people of the Czech Republic, to their credit, have a little bit of control over their government. There's nothing getting built in the Czech Republic. They just opened the so-called missile defense base in Romania, and they just started construction on the one in Poland. They had previously put them on ships, which they thought nobody would notice, right? And what's the justification for having expanded NATO right up to the border of Russia, still trying to get Ukraine and Georgia into it? Major military exercises in Poland, ships in the Black Sea, ships in the Baltic Sea, exploring the Arctic, making threats to Russia, false accusations against Russia in the Ukraine, and putting these missile bases right on the edge of this country that's been attacked so many times and lost so many lives, and won the war that the U.S. pretends it won in all of its movies and celebrates as the justification for 70 years of bad wars ever since, right? What's the justification? Because Russia is now threatening European countries if they continue to collaborate in what it sees as aggression and treaty violation and steps toward world war. It's the United States defending itself from Iran with missile bases on the border of Russia. And last year, when they made this agreement with Iran and said Iran is now a threat to nobody, you can't shoot a missile at anybody, everything's fixed with Iran, you thought, well, they're going to have to come up with a different excuse for putting these missile bases on the edge of Russia. But they didn't. They just went with the same story. It's to protect the United States from Iran, which Americans, for the most part, couldn't care less what the excuse is, and if they hear it, they might just as well believe it. And the Russians never believed to begin with, right? So what did they really lose? And this is what, in terms of war lies, first it has to be very public, People have to know about it. Then there has to be a side that talks sense based on facts that people hear about. And then they can take the right opinion when they're given the two choices. Somebody else? Back there?
So what do you think, bottom line, is going on in the American, political psyche, that they've got this need to continue propagating war continuously over the centuries? What is it?
Well, to some extent, we can differentiate between the general public or parts of the public and the U.S. government. If they did have to have a public referendum before every war, they wouldn't get every war, right? But people in 1989, when the Cold War supposedly ended, that has now been, kick-started again, and nobody knows it, which makes it that much more dangerous this time. People thought when the Soviet Union ended, well, all the wars would stop because the U.S. government had been saying all its wars around the world in all these poor countries were defense against the Soviet Union. I mean, people actually, well-meaning peace activists actually believed that, right? Which is to sort of miss the point that the U.S. has been seeking absolute military domination of the earth since before the creation of the United States, right? I mean, and when England sent settler colonist soldiers into Northern Ireland and handed out money for Irish heads, and then took those skilled veterans of that operation and sent them to the United States and started handing out money for native scalps. This was a tradition that was just going to expand and expand and expand. You had a revolution that was very much about taking Canada, about expanding west and killing Native Americans without British restraint. You had a civil war because the North and the South were in absolute agreement on the need to expand westward, but couldn't agree on how to do it. You've had endless, even the New York Times a few weeks ago accusing Barack Obama of being the first president to have, major wars for all 8 years, even though, it isn't over yet, and the longest war in U.S. history in Afghanistan. You have to pretend the Native Americans are not real people to say stuff like that. The United States has been at war forever, since before it was the United States, Patrick Henry in a church in Richmond pretending to be a slave while owning actual slaves, had financial interests in expanding westward And what he really said in that speech I guarantee, did not resemble the speech that was concocted decades after he died and passed down to us. You know, the U.S. tradition is very much dominate the world with war on behalf of the responsibility of the white race and manifest destiny and the bringing of Christianity and civilization, or democracy and human rights and women's rights. I mean, it evolves a little. But the public has gotten better in a lot of ways. And there's a section of the public now, they have to pretend the wars are philanthropic. You know, they can market the same war as, you know, kill all those evil Libyans, and we must bomb Libya because we care about them. You know, it's for human rights, and we're going to rescue people from a looming massacre, even though it wasn't real and that wasn't legal, and they went ahead and overthrew the government the next week. You know, there's a section of the public that has to be told better lies. And then there's a section of the public that resists all the lies and says, no, we don't need to have wars anymore. If we can choose a different alternative in 2013 and in 2015, we do that every time. We don't ever have to choose war. And there was an article in the Politico newspaper a few weeks ago where a top Pentagon official says, you know, all this hype about Russia's superior military and all this aggression toward Russia, which, by the way, no more true than it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, is driven by a bureaucratic desire for a reason to exist for the army, and I would add NATO, and by the desire for profit. I mean, they just openly tell a newspaper, this is driven by profit. You know, war profiteering used to be shameful. They almost nationalized it in the 30s because it was the private profiteering was considered so shameful. Now it's openly defended and joked about and chatted about. And that's not, you know, that's not exactly the public. That's the oligarchy. You know, there's a serious academic study a year or two back that found the United States is essentially an oligarchy. If you look at who holds what opinions and what the government actually does. You know, this is the problem. And the public has been told it's powerless. This is the top lie they tell us. It's ludicrous. You know, they pay close attention to everything we do, and a few more of us could radically change everything, but they tell us we're powerless, and they tell us the one place you can have a little bit of influence is in voting, which, as Emma Goldman said, if voting ever changed anything, they would ban it. We should have elections. We should have a legitimate election in the United States, but we don't right now, and we're not going to get it. We're not going to vote it into being. But I think, you know, the public is moving in the right direction, and if we look at the example of the other 96% of humanity, represented by governments that invest dramatically less in militarism. I mean, there are a handful of governments that per capita or per GDP, as if, you know, when you have more money you should spend more on war, this sort of measurement, that are above the United States, but nowhere close in absolute volume. But the vast majority of countries, by any measurement, you know, are nowhere close to the United States in investment in militarism. And we talk about it as inevitable, natural, part of human nature, it's in our genes. You know, other people don't talk that way and don't think that way. And there isn't any evidence that it's that way. And war was not present in anything like what we think of as war for hunter-gatherers before cities, which is the vast majority of our existence as a species. Since then, it's been very sporadic. It's come and go. Cultures have had war and done away with it for centuries. You try and do studies and find, where do they have wars? Is it where there's population density or resource scarcity or this or that? Nothing. There's no correlation with anything. It's culture. It's cultures that accept war have war, right? It's a cultural choice, and we can choose not to have it. And if you look at what it takes, the conditioning that it takes to get people to fight wars, you know, it's intense. To suggest that it's natural is ludicrous. 80% of the troops in the good war, World War II, didn't shoot at the enemy. They hadn't been conditioned to do something that awful. You know, they have to be severely conditioned, like you train firemen to go into a fire without thinking to do something like that. And then, now that they all are conditioned to do that, they come back and they aren't conditioned to survive a society that frowns on murder. And they come back severely disturbed from the moral trauma of participating in war and seeing death and causing death. But also, as you know, the New York Times reported last week, modern war through explosions destroys the human brain, right? And because scientists can now see visually, looking in their microscopes at a brain, what having been near explosions did to that brain, we're all supposed to take it seriously, which I hope we do. But you know, you had hundreds of thousands of young men and women coming back from recent US wars with their brains, their minds, their psyches, it's all the same, severely damaged. You know, always we should be taking it seriously, you know, but they're, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, you know, whether you call it physical or you call it mental, is a severe problem. And there is not a single case of it from war deprivation, right? I mean, every single case of it comes from participation. And to say it's natural, you know, it is the most unnatural thing. The most advantageous thing a U.S. citizen can do, a U.S. resident can do to get a better perspective is go visit another country. You know, talk to some other people, understand how they look at the world, and then come back. Yeah.
Kind of lay a hypothetical on you.
Loud as you can.
I just have a hypothetical. So say you were elected president and you decided, which you so eloquently put earlier, the cause of war is war. So we stopped bombing ISIS or ISIL. We pulled all troops out. We left it alone. How do you see, like, what do you think would happen as them? Do you think that they would continue to spread out into Syria and Iraq and Iran and continue to conquer? Or, I mean, what do you think, like, would happen if we just stopped? Like, do you think they would completely leave us alone? You know, and I know we created the problem, just curious on your thoughts on, like, how that would play out.
Yeah, well, I mean, they largely always did leave us alone. You know, I don't tend to use the word we for the U.S. military because I protest and resist and get arrested trying to stop what it does. So I just, in the third person, talk about the U.S. military rather than we. But, you know, what the U.S. military does is so destructive that leave it alone would be an improvement. But it is not the only option, right? Actual aid, actual non-military aid, actually blowing that $60,000 to drop food on starving people.
Medicine.
It is both moral and beneficial and humanitarian and very good foreign policy. Making people love you is much better foreign policy than making people hate you, right? And the U.S. government, if it were to work for disarmament of that region, which apart from Israel does not produce weapons, right? You know, the vast bulk of the weapons come from the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. I mean, those 6 countries, and far and away the leader being the United States. This is where the weapons come from, right? If the United States were to work for disarmament, you know, it would be, the majority would be done just with US participation alone. But if the US were to pull the strings that it is very capable of pulling with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states and Turkey that have been funding and assisting and arming ISIS, right? And if the United States were to push for disarmament and a real lasting ceasefire from the other regional and world powers involved, I mean, that would be a tremendous first step and would facilitate providing actual aid. I mean, food and water and agricultural help and reconstruction help, you know, which is, again, not something I want the current U.S. government to pretend to do tomorrow, because it would all be part of an effort to overthrow the Syrian government and create another disaster. But to really do it with good intentions, to do it through a reformed and democratized United Nations, to let the more responsible, more democratic governments of that part of the world take a lead in it, and to stop arming and funding and propping up all the other dictatorships in that region, right? I mean, when Assad tortured people for the CIA. It's not like